My name's Sarah Wilson, and I am a designer here at Google, and one of the creators of this series, Design Is. Tonight's topic, Design is History, is about space design. And not just designing any space, but designing a presidential museum. So our speaker, Dr. Louise Bernard, will be talking about the conceptual ideas and all of the hard work that her team has done to design a presidential museum for the future. A little bit more about our speaker. She is the founding director of the Obama Presidential Center Museum. Trained as an academic with an interdisciplinary focus on cultural history, she draws upon her experience as a curator of rare books and manuscripts at Yale, and as a senior content developer at the international museum design firm of Ralph Applebaum Associates. She works across a collaborative team of architects and designers to harness the creative energy of storytelling and to tap into the power of public history. So without further ado, give it up for Louise Bernard.
Good evening, everyone. I'm English, so I carry around a cup of tea with me at all times. And I'm just going to kind of perch myself here. I have some kind of formal remarks that I want to deliver alongside the slide deck that you will see. But first of all, thank you to Sarah for the kind introduction, to Kai Haley and to Nicole Rejwan for the invitation and for all of the logistical assistance, as well as the tech folks who are in the room. So you can see here the title of my talk is Building a Presidential Museum for the Future. But I'd like to think about what that means in terms of the work of the Obama Foundation and its mission, which is to inspire, empower, and connect people to change their world. So a lot of the work that we do in building a presidential museum actually will connect to a lot of the work that you do and you think about in terms of design. We think a lot about diversity, equity, and inclusion in the work that we do. We think about what it means to think outside of the box, what it means to kind of push various paradigms. We're constantly working through the idea of partnerships and collaborations. And then we think very broadly about social infrastructure, about social sustainability, about spatial justice, for example, the idea of smart cities. We're based in Chicago. Or the Obama Presidential Center will be located in Chicago. And then we think a lot about the work of civic institutions like libraries and their relationship to democracy and to democratic practice and process. So I'll just pause for a second on this opening slide. My presentation shares conceptual thinking about the Obama Presidential Center Museum as a new model, and it's a new model for an innovative social and cultural institution. As the first truly urban presidential museum, the work of the Obama Presidential Center is grounded in the power of place, the iconic presence of Chicago, and what we often refer to as the Black metropolis, and in the national and global stories that have shaped and continue to influence the life and work of Barack and Michelle Obama. While the museum will privilege the telling of a nuanced history and will foreground the power of objects to illuminate key aspects of the human experience, the central mission of civic engagement, of the relationship between individual agency and collective action, opens up the space for the visitor to investigate, curate, and forge their own connections between past and present, and then we think about the future. The Presidential Museum of the Future therefore throws into sharp relief key questions about museum making and the forging of a nonpartisan creative commons that is at once flexible, participatory, inclusive, and inspirational. I'm going to share a set of schematic diagrams in the spirit of design thinking. Consider them as kind of refined sketches. And this is a precursor to the way that built space is activated by people and by programs. And my emphasis here is from the perspective of the quote-unquote museum, in as much as the 21st century museum is at once part of a larger social infrastructure, which in this instance includes the dynamic presence of a public library as part of the Chicago Public Library system. As the founding director of the Obama Presidential Center Museum, I'd like to take this opportunity to talk about what it means to make a museum, what it means to construct a museum from the ground up, to envision and shape a living, breathing, social and cultural institution. I'll begin by providing a sense of the physical space that this museum will occupy. I'll consider the role of history, again reflecting on the overarching rubric for this talk, and the importantly, of narrative as it shapes the museum's very reason for being, before turning to the idea of process, or the carefully calibrated work that goes into exhibition design and interpretive planning. I will frame the talk by saying that the museum is still in the early stages of design, and so while the thinking I will share today is schematic in scope and formative in regard to development, it provides the intellectual blueprint that will carry the project through to execution. Why building a presidential museum for the future? Many people think, perhaps naturally, of museums, and especially presidential museums, as being tied to the past. This is the figure of the museum as a kind of musty mausoleum. And while it's critically important to tell the story of the nation's first African-American president, to tell the story of a truly remarkable individual and of the grassroots movement and two-term administration that signaled an epochal shift in American politics, we also want to think about the relevance of this history itself going forward, how a deep-rootedness and understanding of the past and present carries us towards a sense of future possibility. Following the mission and vision of the Obama Foundation to elevate the critically important role of civic engagement, we want to ensure that the everyday visitor sees themselves reflected back in an otherwise phenomenal story, and that younger generations are in turn inspired and equipped to make time-sensitive, much-needed change in their communities. These are perhaps lofty, and we like to think at the same time, grounded ambitions. And so we seek to build a physical experience that offers a space for immersion, for storytelling, for dialogue, to provide the tools to understand how we can all engage with the vital issues that shape the world in which we live. Our goal then is to unpack the traditional model of the quote-unquote presidential library and to situate the museum as part of a dynamic center, the first truly urban presidential center situated in Jackson Park and deeply rooted on Chicago's South Side. I do want to pause and say that this is a rendering. It does not exist in reality. This is a visualization. This is the future state of this thing that we're crafting, that we're dreaming of. While we may refer to the center's buildings and landscape as a quote-unquote campus, we might think of it not as a place of encampment or enclosure, a barrier to people who don't feel that they may belong on a campus. But rather, we think about the campus as a civic or creative commons, where local Chicago residents and visitors, estimated at some 700,000 people a year from across the country and from around the world, will gather to share experiences and ideas and to participate in the timely, ongoing work of collective action, which is to say a careful understanding of the workings of democracy and what it means broadly to be an active participant of a country, of the world. In this regard, the museum functions as the de facto anchor for the Obama Presidential Center, and the museum is that vertical building. It's kind of a glowing beacon or a lantern on the landscape. It will be the most public-facing manifestation in physical terms of the ideals and mandates bound up in the Obama Foundation's core mission of civic engagement and the training of future leaders. And it will exist then as a platform not only for people already engaged in the public sphere, but in service to a general audience of all ages, some of whom may be coming to this history or this sense of connection and purpose for the first time. It's important to note that this new museum will also join a consortium of other institutions within the environs of what we loosely refer to as Museum Campus South. Institutions such as the Museum of Science and Industry, you can see it's that kind of neoclassical building just in adjacency behind the museum tower, or the DeSable Museum of African American History. And we want to understand through ongoing dialogue with our colleagues the sort of connections that can be forged between our respective platforms and programs. So you can see here a very early model of the center. For anyone who works in the design space, you understand that design is an iterative, cross-disciplinary, collaborative process. So the design itself constantly under review. I'll talk in the kind of process section a little bit more about the architects, but many of you may be familiar with the work of Todd Williams and Billy Chen for TWBTA. One of their most recent projects is the Barnes Foundation in Philadelphia. So here you can see this early model, and it's showing a central portion of the campus, which we refer to again loosely as kind of the central campus, or the central zone of a 19-acre campus. So this is a diagrammatic kind of distillation of the relationship between the buildings as it relates to this concept of placemaking. The central zone of the center is made up of 3 individual buildings, which you see here, 2 of which, the museum and the forum, are connected below grade, and what we refer to as the garden level. So there's the green space of the landscape, and this green space kind of descends below grade into a series of smaller courtyards. And again, this is keeping in mind Chicago's seasonal flux. So drawing upon the ideal of democratic spacemaking, the 3 buildings, including notably a branch of the Chicago Public Library, embrace this central plaza. So again, thinking about the democratic sense of forum and plaza. The plaza, you could think about the piazza, the town square, the marketplace, the agora. This is a space for radical welcome, a sense of radical hospitality. It's a place for convening, a space enlivened by the presence of public art, or art that lives in the public sphere, and by the programmed as well as impromptu performances that might take place on any given day. And there's really no controlling how people will use and activate a space. And so it's interesting to envision what this building, this center, this campus can be, and then what it will be once the doors are open to the people to really activate and engage with it. There's also a 4th building, which is further south on the campus, and this is the Program, Athletic, and Activity Center. It's a space that can be used for larger convenings and trainings, with a particular emphasis, at least programmatically, on health and wellness. And this draws back to Mrs. Obama's initiatives as First Lady. So you can see here this kind of a dialogic interplay between the public park, the public library, and also the idea of a digital ecosystem, that the physical is in relationship to the digital ecosystem that frames the visitor experience. And we do a lot of work around what we call experiential planning. What will it mean to physically engage with this space? This is just a simple distillation, again, of that idea, thinking through the synergy of the spaces. So for the museum, front and center is obviously the idea of the story and exhibit making, and that's enveloped by a sense of program, educational programs, for example. In the forum building, that central building, programs are front and center, in which there is a relationship to exhibit making and storytelling. And then finally, the library is that 3rd space of kind of knowledge circulation and production. I'm just going to go back for a second. So the importance of this site and the significance of the Obama Foundation's work can only really be understood in relationship to the broader history of the Black metropolis. Chicago was a central hub, as many of you may know, of the Great Migration. It was a destination during the early decades of the 20th century for those de facto refugees fleeing the Jim Crow terror of the Deep South. Chicago offered a place of respite, the promise of prosperity, even in the face of continued segregation and often great hardship. We might think of Chicago as a crucible for cultural formation. Many of you may be familiar with the Harlem Renaissance, for example. So to think about Chicago as being a counterpart to that movement. It's a sentiment that is echoed in the art of Archibald Motley, in the sharp-eyed naturalism of Richard Wright, in the poetic economy of Gwendolyn Brooks. The artist Theaster Gates, who is a contemporary practitioner, and works through his Rebuild Foundation to salvage, reclaim, and revitalize decaying or empty spaces on the South Side, states that, quote unquote, beauty is a basic service. So to really think about design in its relationship to beautification. And so we like to think deeply about how to create a space of beauty within a space that is itself generally cast as one of nihilism and violent dispossession, of poverty and gun crime. And yet the South Side, in which we are deeply rooted, remains a place still of great creativity and great tenacity. The work of the museum, in synergy with the OPC, the Obama Presidential Center, as a civic commons, and with other civic-minded projects already on the ground, is to connect to and harness that energy and that potential, ensuring, as I noted earlier, that history is always at the heart of placemaking and that it always feels timely and relevant to its consumers. In this regard, we also think, with democratic spacemaking in the background, about the work of interpretive planning and about the role of the arts. So this is a history museum for all intents and purposes. It's a narrative museum. But we think about the importance of cultural practice, or what we might refer to as praxis, which is the engagement, the application, exercise, or practice of ideas. So while science and technology sit, as we all assume, at the cutting edge of human endeavor, we might consider the way in which art and artists, including designers, push the boundaries on how we understand what it truly means to be human in a particular time and place. Art making is in many respects a primal force. It's a language we develop in many ways before speech. And so in the process of building a museum for the future, we seek to bring these voices to the table to help us to shape or forge the space of the center itself. In terms of a presidential connection, we might think about the way in which President and Mrs. Obama made a conscious decision to privilege the role of the arts at the White House, rehanging collections on loan from the National Gallery, inviting artists, writers, painters, musicians, dancers, designers to enter the space as active collaborators on pressing social issues, as well as to mentor youth in the act of giving back. Art-based programs will therefore invigorate the otherwise seemingly insular corridors of presidential history, for the goal is always to build upon associations and to think expansively. So here we come to the idea of the physical space to museum visitor flow and the connections that have been made between the three central buildings. So the museum will tell the story of the Obama administration, and this didactic element is but one part of a holistic model of a center that fosters connections between its component parts. This is what we refer to in the field of museum design as the interpretive master plan. It is the framework that drives the visitor experience. The museum embodies the idea of a journey of ascension, hence the vertical circulation. The museum is in a vertical building, of moving upward from the grassroots, from a sense of me to we. We consider the building as the metaphor of a vessel or a lantern, of a beacon on the landscape that seeks to inspire. So the way in which the mission is part of, again, the built environment. This sense of individual agency is then conjoined through participatory programming in the democratic space of that central building, the forum. The forum will include amenities such as a small auditorium, multi-purpose maker spaces or civic labs, along with discrete spaces for hands-on productivity. such as a recording studio. Again, music was very important to the Obama White House. There'll be a restaurant and a cafe that will also have interpretive ties to the kitchen garden, which will live on the site. And this complements the idea of the White House fruit and vegetable or kitchen garden that was an initiative of Mrs. Obama's, again, connecting to her work around health and wellness. And then we see within this formation the possibility of a third space of interaction, which is a small branch of the Chicago Public Library. So again, unpacking the traditional model of the presidential library. This is a place for knowledge formation and circulation, accessible and open to all. You might think about all of the work that public libraries do, all of the social issues that public libraries often have to contend with, whether that's homelessness, mental health. Importantly, we want to think about how each of these amenities will best serve not only a range of visitors, national and international, but also Southside residents in a way that will ensure that the local community, our neighbors, feel a sense of true ownership and participation. If we think about just the vertical circulation and to really understand what it means to move through a building of this kind, we do a lot of work around inclusive design, again, above and beyond ADA standards, but thinking about what real accessibility, that radical hospitality means. There are various spaces that are actually color-coded here, so I'll just explain them. The areas in blue are kind of exhibits that live across the center. The areas in orange are program spaces. The yellow spaces are referencing kind of non-ticketed areas, especially within the museum building. The core exhibits that tell the story of the Obama presidency will be ticketed. But again, we think about the ways in which costs should never be a barrier for visitation. So again, thinking through the foundation's mission. This actually just kind of lays out the different chapters, which I will talk about a little bit more. There you see the bottom of the tower. So moving to the idea of history. So I've talked a little bit about kind of the interpretive framework, now really thinking about the story that we're telling. And storytelling, the power of storytelling goes to the heart of any museum. It's also a key element in the work of grassroots organizing, and it's been central to the work of President Obama, beginning with his community work on the South Side. But this is a president who is himself a writer and a thinker. He is a storyteller par excellence in the finest tradition of American letters. It's storytelling that helps us to make a sense of the connection between individual agency, the story of self, and collective action, the means by which a vibrant democracy is lived and practiced. While the narrative arc of President and Mrs. Obama's story forms the spine of the museum, that primary arc is interwoven with a deep historical context, with the foundational narrative of African American and civil rights history, of the Black metropolis, as mentioned in its relationship to Chicago, of American progressive history. We might think of the women's movement, gay rights, environmentalism, to name just a few of those movements and milestones, as well, and importantly to this story, the concept of what we might call loosely the counter-narrative. And it's the counter-narrative, whether that is the history of race and racism or popularism, that will serve to be a push and pull against the tenets of American progressive movements. So it's this woven narrative, the museum's essential DNA, that makes up, again, that interpretive framework that will guide the visitor experience. The dotted lines on the narrative arc indicate those formative narratives that shape our contemporary society, the points at which we might stretch back, for example, to the nation's founding documents, to the history of racialized slavery, to the trans-historical connections that might be forged between, say, Abraham Lincoln and the inauguration of the nation's first African-American president. At the same time, we are cognizant of the need for timeliness, for a way to make sense of history in a very recent events, as very recent history moving forward. In this regard, the past must feel connected to the present and to the issues that, in many ways, continue to haunt us. How might we continue to track and monitor the history of voting rights, of mass incarceration, or the impact of nuclear non-proliferation? How can we engage visitors to best understand their role as social actors, to understand that history is always in the making, and that progress, however we may wish to define it, is never a simple linear march through time? In terms of making this history digestible, visitors of all ages should leave the museum with a clearly defined takeaway about the high-level issues that shaped the Obama presidency, topics such as healthcare or climate change, and representative examples of foreign policy, for instance, the Iran nuclear deal, the opening up of relations with Cuba, as well as those pivotal moments, again, the high points as well as the low points, that continue to shape this president's legacy. Yet these topics should also be presented as teachable moments, and this is where good design comes into play, wherein visitors can understand the mechanics of how this impossible thing called governance actually works. In that regard, the seemingly removed and rarefied world of individual diplomacy becomes a set of strategic questions that an individual might apply to a town hall debate, to the exercise of participatory budgeting, to negotiations with an uncooperative landlord. You can imagine that the scenarios are legion and expansive. Most importantly, again, to reiterate, the visitor must see themselves reflected back in the telling of this presidential narrative, in this otherwise remarkable yet quintessentially American story. It's a story in many regards that could only emerge out of a city like Chicago. In the realm of storytelling, there is much to be said for the power of the museum as a multi-dimensional experience. While we must acknowledge the role of the digital in everyday life, there's something instantly engaging about real artifacts and the role they play in enlivening a narrative and its historical context. So while the NARA, the National Archives and Records Administration archives of the Obama Presidential Library, will be housed off-site, they will not be physically located at the center. And while the unclassified paper documents will be digitized, the museum as a collecting institution must still take seriously the role of stewardship, the primary role of a museum, of preserving and sharing these unique papers and objects in perpetuity for generations to come. You can see here the range of materials that will be on display: manuscripts, correspondence, books, textiles, ephemera such as campaign memorabilia, and symbolic items such as one of President Obama's signing pens, all of which provide a sense of texture and authenticity to the museum experience. Physical objects drawing from the interwoven, nuanced historical narrative, that essential kind of DNA, will be supported, again, in innovative ways by documentary images, various types of audiovisual properties, and immersive experiences such as virtual and augmented reality that will bring people and places to life in emotionally engaging ways. And importantly, we want to think about all of the community-related assets that we might thread throughout this narrative. The images, stories, sounds, voices, particularly the importance of oral history that make up the power of place. So you can see here just a breakdown, again, diagrammatically, of digital experiences in the plural, the many ways to shape the telling of this shared and relatively recent history. And I would say that within the kind of idea of exhibit making, we constantly want to find a balance between the digital and the analog. We really want to modulate and syncopate experience. We want to ensure that people are engaging with each other and not simply with their smartphones. So we want to think about how technology can certainly enhance the visitor experience, but that the visitor needn't feel tethered to it, needn't feel weighted down by it. So there's lots of interesting work that we can do in the technology space. We have to think a lot about future forecasting, future proofing, so to speak. There is obviously an inbuilt obsolescence to technology. Things will date, hardware will date very easily, very quickly. And so we also want to think about just how to kind of balance all of those pieces. So key to the work of the digital and the work of the digital ecosystem is the idea of the before, during, and after sense of a visit. So the goal is to run programs before the physical center, the building, opens, whether that's collaborating with other museums on temporary exhibitions or establishing a series of community design workshops as part of the museum making process. But once the Obama Presidential Center opens, it will be the physical destination, the place where visitors will encounter programs such as docent-led tours, hands-on interactives, and other activities such as facilitator-led workshops on key topics that are presented in the museum. There'll be film series and talks and symposia. Importantly, the center will house a special exhibitions gallery, which will represent a roster of exhibitions relating to key topics tied to the Foundation's mission. This will be one of the main vehicles for bringing people back for repeat visits to the center. And so while the Obama Presidential Center will be a destination in a revitalized urban park, it's encompassed in various ways by this idea of the digital domain, which is an ecosystem of web and mobile technologies that will help people to connect to the work of the Obama Foundation before their visit. It will shape and document their physical experience of the museum during an on-site visit. And it will help them, the visitor, to reconnect in new ways to the Foundation's ever-expansive networks of individual leaders or organizations and projects. The goal is to help people to connect to others, often across ideological divides, in a way that promotes a sense of empathy, and that's one of our key values. And this, we think about empathy or rational compassion as it relates to the impact on the public sphere. It should be noted that President Obama was the first truly digital president who harnessed the then still nascent power of the internet and all of its capabilities. We think about the smartphone being in its infancy in 2008. And he used the power of the digital to really revolutionize the democratic process of a presidential campaign. And obviously, we've seen a shift take place if we think about the election of 2016. And again, it's really helping people, the visitor, to understand the associational connections as they track back to this deeper sense of history. So at the same time, as we think about all of those connected pieces, the digital domain may live independently from the physical experience of a site visit, so that people who may never have the opportunity to visit in person can still connect with the museum's core narrative and act upon the work of the Foundation and the center at large. And I should note, and this is something that many of you I'm sure also thinking about, the importance of fact-based research, of how knowledge is produced and circulated is also central to the work that we do. And so that new technologies play an important role in terms of communication and pedagogy, but we also want to ensure that this is a place for contemplation and for reflection, and that the visitor can commune with the objects that help to tell these stories, that they can be enriched and moved by the art that surrounds them. So I'm going to talk in a very high level, very briefly, about the idea of process, that museum making is a highly collaborative and interdisciplinary endeavor. It draws upon the work of the architects, as I mentioned, Todd Williams, Billy Chen for TWBTA, on an exhibition design team, Ralph Applebaum Associates, who are known most recently for their work on the National Museum of African American History and Culture, which opened on the Mall in Washington, D.C. in the fall of 2016, as well as a host of content specialists, members of the Obama administration, White House staff, and other key personnel, historians of the period, and scholars or other experts with deep knowledge of the subjects that will form the core history of the museum. Building and shaping a museum from the ground up is directly tied to the design of the project. A museum, after all, is not an office building. It's not a private residence. Its function is to deliver to a diverse public a physical experience that is both meaningful and memorable. In this regard, form and content should speak to each other. And more than that, they really need to sing on key and in harmony. So we're constantly thinking about the relationship between form and function. This speaks to the team organization at Ralph Applebaum Associates. Museums are, of course, physical experiences, and textual history must be rendered in three-dimensional space. In terms of interpretive planning for such a project, the exhibition design team draws from across a range of disciplines. So content developers who help to craft and structure the written narrative and its sense of flow. There's a lot about flow and dwell time and throughput within the space. 3D designers who work alongside the architects to shape the physical space of the exhibition galleries, and then 2D designers who, of course, work with graphic assets, with typography and color palettes to create a carefully modulated environment. And then there are digital and media consultants who ensure that the story is projected in a way that captures the spirit and the emotion of this particular presidential period. In terms of this reference to Chicago collaborators, as a project, we wanted to take to heart the power of placemaking and to engage with a group of practitioners on the ground in Chicago, several of whom have close ties to the South Side. Importantly, as architects, designers, and artists, these team members are also pedagogues whose practice is informed by their teaching. Our goal is to look for ways to engage local residents and especially student populations in the very act and process of design, to solicit their input and ideas through a series of workshops, design charrettes, and prototyping, really testing, mocking up the spaces and testing those with focus groups. And then I will say in closing that this is the spirit in which we do all things. And I will acknowledge that one museum experience that I do draw upon in thinking about building this particular museum is that of the National Museum of African American History and Culture. I'm not sure how many people have had the opportunity to visit. There are people here who have been able to get to the museum in DC. I worked on that project as a content developer, as the lead for the history galleries, which kind of form the spine of the museum. And it was interesting to see that project from before groundbreaking, to really see it as a series of blueprints, of sketches, when the land itself was just a patch of grass, and then to go back and watch people really move through the space. I would say for that particular museum, which is telling 400 years of history, it's something that speaks to cross-generational aspects of a single family. So you'll see infants in strollers, great-grandparents in wheelchairs, with all family members in between. You see parents really talking to their teenagers, for example, about the content. We talk a lot in terms of museum making about kind of the quote-unquote Instagrammable moment, the selfie moment. But we're finding that people are actually taking photographs of the label text. They're actually hungry for that information that they take away with them. The dwell time, the amount of time that a visitor spends in a museum for a Smithsonian institution, tends to be about 2 hours. As many of you know, you can get a kind of museum fatigue as you move through spaces. You can tire quite quickly. But people are spending 4 to 6 hours, sometimes 8 hours in this museum. They will line up to get a pass. The museum was at capacity every day for the early years, in fact, of its opening. But people will line up to get in as soon as the doors open, and they spend all day kind of moving through this fully immersive space. It's also a museum that has large-scale artifacts. There's a segregated rail car, for example, or the Tuskegee training plane. But there are also very small objects, and it's really understanding the way in which an object needn't have mass scale to be meaningful. It can be a tiny thing that is that emotional connector. I think, for example, of a wedding ring that was used by enslaved peoples in their marriage rituals. Marriages were illegal between enslaved peoples. So the emotional weight that that small ring carries and that has been maintained and passed along from one family member to the next is really very moving and meaningful. So I would say also there is the idea of the kind of pilgrimage effect, and it's something that the National Portrait Gallery has seen a huge upswing in visitor attendance because people want to stand before those truly phenomenal portraits of President and Mrs. Obama by Kehinde Wiley and Amy Sherald, respectively. So we think about that kind of pilgrimage effect. Many people of a certain demographic did not think they would live to see that moment in 2008. So these are the kinds of ideas we draw upon as we think about crafting a visitor experience. So we're left then not only with the lessons of history, but with the power of possibility to inspire people and to create real change. And that, in turn, is the work of the design field as it relates to building a museum from the ground up. So I will close there, and I think we have some time maybe to take questions. Thank you.
Hi, did you build the building first and then the exhibits around that, or was it vice versa?
It's a wonderful question to ask. And again, it goes back to the heart of the kind of form and function. I will say that the architects have been selected and the concept for the building generated before I came on board at the foundation. So in many regards, the museum is leading. The building, the physical space, is leading. And then we're using the idea of verticality to kind of map onto it the story that we're telling. So it's an interesting way to work. I think in an entirely ideal universe, there would be a direct synergy or interplay between those two design moments of building the building and really thinking about the program that will live in it. But we find for various reasons that the architecture naturally comes first. And then you think about the story that can inhabit that space.
So it feels like your museum, more than maybe most museums, has to play this tricky balance between a historical narrative and timeliness. Mm-hmm. So you have maybe a museum of natural history on one end of the spectrum, and then the museum of, like, there's a news museum in DC that, mm-hmm. and their whole the front of that museum is just like daily newspapers, mm-hmm. right, which is great. And so there's that on the one hand for you, and then on the other hand, you've also got the fact that it's around this political legacy. Mm-hmm. So how do you have, like, guiding principles for how you decide how you structure your permanent exhibition and mm-hmm. your like the rotating programming? Like, what's your barometer for timeliness and mm-hmm. how to include that in a way that the museum stays relevant, as well mm-hmm. as telling the narrative?
Yeah, that's a great question. So it goes back to the kind of central DNA and that tracking back and tracking forward. In terms of the visitor experience, so the first level, and I'll just kind of break down what the chapters are. So the first level kind of tracks back into history, and we think about on whose shoulders we stand, all of the people who went before, who made President Obama's story possible, that kind of pivotal watershed moment in 2008. And that narrative goes all the way through the idea of grassroots organizing, the 2008 campaign, through to the election night and inauguration. The next level is about the first term of the administration, really understanding the transition between the Bush administration to the Obama administration. It's a moment, as many of you will recall, of economic crisis, a global economic meltdown. And that first level then tends to skew towards domestic policy, so we're able to tell the story of domestic policy, key pieces of legislation like the Affordable Care Act, also the fact that the president was a wartime president, the nation was at war every single day of those 8 years. The next level is kind of, we jokingly call a palate cleanser, and it's about life in the White House. We constantly think about the fun and the grind of this administration. There'll be a replica of the Oval Office on that level, and will also be activated by augmented reality, for example, kind of bringing the space to life. And then the next level is naturally the second term of the administration. So you have that kind of modulation of experience. And in terms of the second term, it skews more towards foreign policy because of all of the work that was being done over the 8 years and kind of culminating in that second term. So Iran, Paris Agreement, Cuba was kind of happening then. And then we think about the president's farewell address, his passing of the baton, so to speak, to the everyday citizen, in quotation marks. And that is the work of the foundation, and that then is the living legacy. So we have a very careful, thoughtful historical narrative that then is tracking forward to the work that the foundation is doing around the civic engagement space. And it's a way then that we can track many of the issues that were central to that historical narrative. whether it is the issue of nuclear non-proliferation, whether it is the issue of social justice and mass incarceration, or of a broader sense of rights, a rights discourse. So I think that will be kind of the timeliness, and asking people to engage around the concept of civics and civic action. So you really get to tell this history, and then you help people to see themselves as social actors in relationship to that history, and that then becomes the timeliness. And I think in many regards it is part of a relationship to the principals, to President and Mrs. Obama, who are still relatively youthful, very dynamic figures. So it will be a work in progress to understand how, especially from a scholarly perspective, the history is being understood over time, and especially between the various administrations. We think about the current political moment that we're in. That may shift in 2020. By the time this museum opens, there may be a different understanding of democratic process or progress, or not, who knows, you know. So that is really an engaging way to think about history as this dynamic thing. It's not a static thing. It's always in motion, it's always in process. Does that answer your question? Okay, thank you.
It sounds like you touch on a lot of the different fields of design, architecture, public history, and so on and so on. Do you have one particular discipline that you secretly love the most?
I do love the content. I do love the history. I'm currently reading Samantha Power's memoir, The Education of an Idealist. And I really love kind of delving into the history of the administration's work, especially around foreign policy. I think I have a secret hankering to have been a diplomat or something like that. So I'm really engaged around the history, and also how this particular story fits into a broader understanding of American history, democratic process, practice. That's the piece that I really love. But I do love, my background is as actually a rare book and manuscript curator. That's where I kind of got my footing as a curator. So I do love objects, and I love books and manuscripts. The kind of archival piece is very meaningful to me. But I've learned a lot by working with designers. As someone who is very text-based, who's very connected to narrative and to the written word, it's amazing to work with people who can see in three-dimensional space. It's a different kind of vocabulary, and it's kind of opened up my understanding of the built environment in which we live. I have a tendency now to look at floors and ceilings and windows and doors in a different kind of way, because I'm working with designers who have this other kind of worldview, a different way of seeing.
So one of my favorite things about the African History Museum in DC is, as a very creative kind of visual designer, I'm noticing the intricacies of the detail to the architecture and the conceptual of like the way that the opening of the concept of the light shining through to the typography, how it becomes more kind of, I guess, sans serif as you go upwards and you get into more contemporary times. You can feel the color palette. It goes from really dark and then it gets lighter. And I would imagine there's a lot of collaboration between the architects, the graphic designers, the spatial designers. How do those concepts kind of weave together to feel like one? Are those designers working together? What's that creative process like?
Well, it's wonderful to hear you kind of read back
I
your
was
kind of
geeking out the whole
design
time.
sensibility of moving through the space. You hit the nail on the head in terms of how palette and typography is helping also to tell the story. It is very collaborative. I'd say it's very collaborative between the curatorial side, which is kind of me and my team, and the relationship to objects with the exhibit designers. And the 2D designers are kind of embedded within the exhibit design team. So they're constantly thinking about materiality and about the use of typography, for example. We're taking an element of Gotham, which was used in the Obama campaign, but also having to rethink it in some ways in terms of inclusive design. How does typography, how can it be read, especially by people who have low vision? So we're thinking constantly about the kind of the interplay between design and inclusive design. But yeah, so we're in the process now of really thinking about color palette, how it will relate to lighting, even the sound design, the soundscape in relationship to color can give a real sense of place and of time. So that is ongoing work. We're currently in design development, and that will run probably for another few months. The schedule often shifts around a construction project, and then we'll move into final design, which is when the materiality, the sense of really understanding the look and feel of the space is refined and finalized. But it is a very collaborative sense, and we want to capture in different ways the spirit of the time. So there's the period in which we think about President Obama's childhood, but then you can think about the kind of energy that came through the grassroots movement, and really capturing that sensibility.
You said that you had your start in rare book collections, is that right? So with the branch of the Chicago Public Library being on campus, how will that library be different for its being part of the Obama Center, but also still being a public library?
Yeah, so I think on the one hand, it will be a very small branch of the Chicago Public Library, so a small footprint, but because it's connected to a center, the kinds of programs that CPL runs will have more space in a kind of a different part of the campus. So it's a wonderful amenity. I think it's an amenity that was much needed in the neighborhood, that there wasn't a public library within relatively easy walking distance. And again, to go back to all of the work that public libraries do, they're really these kind of wide-ranging social, infrastructural kinds of spaces. So it's really wonderful to have a public library at the center, as opposed to what in the traditional model would be the archive. So the archive, that is all of the records produced during the Obama administration, will be housed off-site. The interesting thing to keep in mind is that, again, as the first digital president, 95% of those records were born digital without paper equivalents. So 5% need to be digitized to meet that other kind of digital body. That 5% is actually 30 million pages. So it's a vast undertaking to digitize, but then eventually to make more accessible than ever before the non-classified records of the Obama administration. So we're really trying to think about the 21st century presidential library that comes out of the fact that the archive is now naturally a hybrid one, in which the paper component is diminishing and the digital component is rising. And we have to be able to serve scholarly needs in relationship to the media in which the information is produced. So there's that piece of the equation. But then just the dynamic quality of having a library. There will be a small space within the library that we're calling loosely the president's reading room. And again, that's because the president is himself a reader, writer, thinker. And so we want to think about the importance of books and how it can really speak back to the mission of civic engagement. So I think, to go back to the initial point of your question, the branch will serve as any other branch. So people will still be able to get their Danielle Steele or whatever it is they're reading, their Tom Clancy. But at the same time, we can also curate a collection so that it speaks back to the content that you will find in the museum. So if you want to read about the history of foreign policy as it then impacts the Obama administration, you can find those books. So we're thinking about a non-circulating collection, a kind of reading room environment within the footprint of a circulating collection where people are checking out everyday books. And many people still go to public libraries to check out videos and CDs and things like that. So it will be an interesting dynamic space, I think. And also thinking about small children and programming around literacy will be key.
Hi, thanks for your talk. What I'm wondering is, sorry if there's some overlap with this question. As you've spoken about, Obama's really big into civic engagement, community action. In what ways will the campus kind of give people something that they can do, immediate action that they can do, civic engagement that they can do, something kind of like right now to engage? And in what way will kind of community discussion be a part of the campus?
Yeah, it goes very much to the heart of the center. And so you're right to pick up on that question. I think that in many museum experiences, for example, people take in a certain kind of didactic information. It's been delivered to them in a relatively passive way. And then they leave that experience and there's nothing that they can then actually act upon. So we really want to think about providing people with a kind of a toolkit, a set of resources. And it goes back to the diagram. Let me see if I can just click back for you. To this concept, which is the before, during, and after, and ensuring that when people leave the Obama Presidential Center, they feel they have the means to actually take action. And that could be a small thing, it could be a large thing. It's really about inspiring, connecting, and empowering people to change their world, not the world writ large. So it's these small actions that add up into a larger sense of collective action. And so that's what we hope, that people feel truly inspired and empowered and know that they have the resources to do the work they may be already interested in when they arrive at the center, or it may be something new that they've been exposed to and they suddenly realize they have an interest. It could be a very simple thing like, how do you create a community garden in your neighborhood? How do you connect to other people who are working in the space of climate change? How do you do meaningful work around it could be any number of things around pedagogy, of helping to really connect people back to civic work in the broadest sense.
Well, thank you so much, Louise.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for coming. And yeah, we'll see you next month. Take care.